My name is Alex Ritchie. I'm a student coordinator here at the Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. I'm really excited today. Today is our first Politics in a Pint of the spring semester, and it's on the fiscal cliff. Yeah, big round of applause. It's on the fiscal cliff. Yeah, there we go. It's on the fiscal cliff, or the so-called fiscal cliff. What is it? What happened? What are we going to do moving forward is sort of the exploration that we're going to go on today. So that's the event today. Coming up in a few weeks, we have the McCarthy residency. This year we have a 69 grad, Gary Eichten, coming. So put that on your map. Yeah, again, wow, people are jazzed today. I love it. So put that on your map. He's going to be here for 4 days, from the 11th through the 14th. He'll be doing classroom visits. He'll be speaking with students. So I highly encourage you to go to mccarthycenter.org. Write that down. It's very important. Check out our events page. See what's happening, because it's going to be a great semester. So how this is going to work today, we have with us some members from college Republicans, college Democrats. We have an economics professor and a political science professor. The college Democrats are here. Wow, they're representing. So we're going to go through the political negotiations, what sort of had to happen in Congress, in the executive branch, in order for this to happen. What is the economic side of it? So we're going to have Professor Matt Lindstrom, political science professor and director of the McCarthy Center, go through some of the politics of the situation. We have economics professor John Olson here today. Yes, waving to everybody right there. He's very brilliant, focuses on macroeconomic policy, and is great with this sort of thing. So he'll kind of provide an economics perspective into it. And then we have Dan Walgamot here. Dan, you want to wave to everybody? He doesn't need a microphone, but he's here with College Democrats. He's kind of their lead spokesperson today. So big shout out to them for co-sponsoring. And then Tyler Brown, sporting the bow tie, is here with College Republicans, and he's going to provide his own insights into the situation. And I think we have some members from the Economics Club here. And yeah, there we go, Brandon Oswald. And he'll provide some of sort of what he sees as an economics student when they're studying this. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Matt Lindstrom. And thank you all for coming.
All right, thanks. Thanks a lot, Alex. Definitely don't want to say too much. Want to create a conversation here pretty quick. But so I presume most of you have heard of this term, fiscal cliff, right? And we were scared, really scared there for a while, late December, and what was going to happen if we went, quote, over this cliff. And, you know, that's never a good thing usually if you go over a cliff. And so just a little bit of background maybe on the terminology and how we got to where we are, and just very, very little emphasis on the little. But first of all, it really wasn't a cliff. This was a manufactured term, and Ben Bernanke is given credit for coining the term during one of his, I believe it was a congressional testimony where he offered that term. But the media loves symbols and loves metaphors and loves impending dangers, right? So the fiscal cliff was a very nice metaphor to get folks riled up and draw attention to the very serious realities of our budget deficit as well as the budget debt. Just real quickly, by way of definition, what's the difference between a debt and a deficit? How many of you guys think you might know? Very good. Okay, it's about a third of you. So the deficit is the annual shortfall of any particular budget, whether it's your own personal budget, school budget, or whatever it is. It's the annual shortfall, more spending than revenue. And the debt, of course, is the collection of shortfalls over a long period of time. The fiscal cliff is called a cliff, I guess because of the January 1 time frame whereby a series of tax increases would have been put in place, and as well as a series of spending cuts called sequesters or sequestration because Congress passed a law called the Budget Control Act, I think it was Budget Control Act of 2011, which was so far-fetched that it was meant essentially to force members of Congress to do their job, to figure out the deficit situation, to figure out the long-term debt. And the sequestration, especially these across-the-board spending cuts, both on the the entitlement side as well as what's called the discretionary side, they were seen as kind of so egregious or so sort of radical that it was meant to essentially kind of scare the members of Congress into doing something. And it took Congress, I think, 507 days and a few extra hours to, quote, do something. So they had all this time, well over a year, to strike a deal, to deal with the spending and the tax increases. And, of course, they waited, they actually went over, we so-called went over the cliff, but they backdated conveniently backdated the bill to January 1. So that's just a little bit of background. And as you know, there was a deal that basically punted the spending cuts to March 1st and punted the debts, raised the debt ceiling I think that's another month down the road, April, and then dealt with the tax increases. So some of the tax increases were really going back to tax rates that we already had before, particularly one that affects all of you in this room, every single one of you. And it's not the high income or the over 400,000 income tax. Unfortunately, that does not affect me and Professor Olson. But I don't know, maybe the econ profs, I don't know what their salary range is, but
wish.
Yeah, right. But it's the payroll tax cut. This is the FICA tax, the Social Security tax that all of you pay on your first dollar you make. The first dollar you make. This was rolled back from 6.2 to 4.2 a couple of years ago as a method of kind of stimulating the economy during a recession, and this now is back up to 6.2, and so about 80% of folks in the United States are going to see their taxes go up, and it's primarily, in my view at least, the payroll tax that just hits the vast majority of people. And for me, I'll tell you, it hits me about $1,000 a month, actually a little over, about not 1,000. Sorry, scratch it. About $120 a month, not 1,000. Over 1,000 a year, about 1,200 or so, give or take, a year. But for my family budget, $120 a month, that's real dollars. But you're looking at a deficit, you're looking at a debt. There's two ways of dealing with it. There's spending and there's revenue side. So this is clearly the revenue piece. So we basically kicked the can down the road, which Congress is very good at, apparently, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to stop there. I have a lot of things to say, but there's so many other people that I want to listen to. So do welcome your comments and questions later on, though. So, Professor Olson, you want to say a few words?
I guess I'm up next. I think Matt gave a very good explanation in terms of sort of the sequence of events, and yeah, Ben Bernanke was the author of the fiscal cliff, but most of us, I think, realized that it was more of a fiscal slope in terms of how the changes that would have gone into effect after January 1st had, but not kicked the can down the road. In thinking about this, I guess in terms of having sort of a more informed discussion, I was talking with a couple of students before, and those of you who saw William Gale give the Clemens lecture back last October in talking about the federal deficit, I think it's important to realize that we're actually, in the debate that's going on about debts and deficit, there really are three different deficits that need to be addressed, and that we shouldn't conflate the three in the debate or discussions. One of those, one's a short-term deficit. The second is sort of, I guess we might think of as an intermediate term deficit. As we look out to 2015, 16, 17, out to 2020, in terms of what the budget might look like then. And then there's a third deficit, a long-term deficit, one out there in the 2020s and 2030s. And they each arise from different sources. They're created by different circumstances. That long-term deficit, the one out there, 2025, 2030, is, if you look at what are projected levels of taxation and government spending and government, what we call transfer payments, in particular things like Social Security, Medicare, those sorts of things, we see that there's a problem out there due to the demographic sources that, given the current actuarial estimates in terms of how long people will work and live, we see some problems in our health care budget and in our Social Security budget. One question is, well, gee, when we get out there to the 2020s or 2030s, we could fix it then, cut benefits then, raise taxes then, to solve the problem then. Or perhaps we could undertake policy actions today to begin fixing those problems. Take a look at how we're funding Social Security, look at how we fund Medicare, look at what we are paying as benefits for those programs. So there's a long-term issue there. And that's where you hear the debate and discussion about what should we do with Medicare, what should we do with Social Security. But I guess I would suggest that's one set of problems that is down the pike. In the intermediate term, if we look out to 2015, 2016, 2017, well, presumably by then the economy would be back to full employment. We'd be back at 5.5%, 5% unemployment. The economy would be growing at 2.5%, 3% per year on average. What would, if we were to maintain our current tax code and current projections in terms of what we think we would spend on national defense and the various non-discretionary and discretionary items in the federal budget, what would the budget look like then? Well, there appears that there would be a deficit. And we refer to this as what economists refer to as a structural deficit, that there is something about the structure of our spending and the structure of our taxes that will, at full employment, produce the situation of a deficit. That needs to be addressed. The third and the near-term problem is a deficit that arises because the economy is not operating at full employment. We've just come through the worst recession since the 1930s, the recession of 2008 to 2009. And during recessions, something happens to government budgets. First, because people aren't working or they're working fewer hours, you're not collecting as much tax revenue. Corporations aren't making their profits to be taxed, and so forth. That tax revenues decline. We structured our tax system specifically to take that into account. Reduce the tax burden during tough economic times. Well, the economy's been recovering since the spring of 2009. We're not in a recession now, and we haven't been in one for now almost 4 years. We've been recovering. And it's been a very slow recovery, probably half the pace of a normal recovery. We would have expected that by now we'd be back to full employment, but this recovery has been very, very slow in comparison with past. As well as the decline in tax receipts, you also, during a period of recession, are going to find that you have additional government outlays, that people who are unemployed and qualify can obtain unemployment compensation. There are various other programs that are designed to increase their expenditures during periods of economic contraction in order to assist state and local governments as well as various federal programs to counteract the effects of the recession. So part of our short-term recession right now, or deficit right now, is what we would call a cyclical deficit, that we have not fully recovered in terms of generating the tax revenues because we're not at full employment. Plus, we're having to undertake additional expenditures because we're not fully recovered. And so that, for the short run, or for this recovery period sort of added to the immediate deficit. So I think it's important to keep in mind that you sort of got these three deficits, and what we really probably want to focus on are sort of the latter two of these. One is looking at that intermediate term structural deficit. What changes do we need to make for the next decade in our pattern of government spending and in our tax code to bring the long run or the intermediate run budget deficit back down to a balance? The other question that I think is worth discussing, and certainly is a very political question, is there or are there things that we ought to be doing in the short run to address that short run situation? And here I think the political issue is one of, do you engage in additional policy actions, reducing taxes, increasing government spending, which would widen the short run deficit, but perhaps would move us more quickly back to full employment? Or do we continue with the existing structure and lengthen out this period of recovery, extending it, making the economy, in a sense, take longer to fully recover? So I'll stop there.
Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Now, we may chuckle, but these words spoken by Democrat President John F. Kennedy at his inauguration address in 1961 really kind of outline the way that Democrats currently feel about our current debt and deficit crisis, a balanced approach. We have to think about those who can do more for their country, and we have to think about those who their country needs to do more for them. A balanced approach goes back to what Professor Lindstrom talked about earlier, how there are two parts of things to this current crisis that we're in. There's the spending side, and there's the revenue side. Democrats support a balanced approach to dealing with this debt and deficit crisis, both the spending side and the revenue side. Now, you don't have to take the word from me as a Democrat. You can also take the word of the American people who voted in the 2012 election. They also favor a balanced approach. The Democrat in the White House won the election. Democrats in the Senate won the popular vote of the country. And Democrats in the U.S. House of Representatives won the popular vote. So the American people support a balanced approach. One of the things that Professor Lindstrom spoke about with the debt, or with the fiscal cliff legislation, was the raising of revenues. What happened in the bill was it was for every dollar that a per individual makes over $400,000, not all of their money, but for every dollar that they make above $400,000. So if you're just making $399,000, your taxes didn't change at all. It's for every dollar that you make above that. So if you're making $401,000, you're only taxed on that $1. You're increased by, 3.6% on that $1. So don't think that a balanced approach means that it's time to go after the wealthy and it's time to go after the job creators, because we're not. We appreciate that, that this country is very entrepreneurial. Business is great. But we really have to think about those who can afford to do a little bit more, and by increasing taxes on the money that folks make above $400,000, we feel like that's a pretty reasonable, balanced approach. Another thing that Democrats really support goes back to what Professor Olson talked about in terms of what do we need to do to deal with this short-term problems that we have with the deficit that we have caused by a downturn in the economy and by the joblessness. Well, one of the things that Democrats really advocated for are for continuing to provide benefits for those who are unemployed. Now, my Republican friends, some may say that that's creating a nanny state, or it's creating a welfare state, or we're encouraging people not to work. But the fact of the matter is, this is the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And if folks don't have those unemployment benefits, that's going to cause our economy to go even further downward and our deficit to go even further into the red because those folks can't afford to go out and buy things and increase what's being sold in the market and increase the economy. One thing I'd like to ask everybody, in terms of, nobody likes tax raises, but I'd really like us to think about some of the things that the government pays for. And some of my Republican friends will talk about, like I said earlier, a nanny state or a welfare state where the government's paying these people to be lazy. But I'm just curious if democracy is not a spectator sport, and politics in a pint is definitely a spectator event. So get your hand loosened up here. How many of you in here went to a public school or know somebody who went to a public school? Let's see, raise your hands. All right. Well, you guys are government moochers because you're weaning off the government. Come on now. How many people in here have ever been to a library or know somebody that's been to a library? Let's see, raise your hands. Okay. Well, everybody besides Matt's a government moocher then. We can go, the list goes on and on. How many people in here like that there's a fire department that's going to come and save your precious possessions when your house is on fire? What's that? Yeah, exactly. The list goes on and on. How many people here have a grandma or grandpa or know somebody who has a grandma or grandpa? Yeah, I bet they like Social Security, and I bet they like not having to work out in the streets for a living. So the list goes on, but and lastly, and I think most importantly, and something that touches me very close to home, is how many people have been or know someone who has been in the military, who has made that sacrifice for our country by serving in the military. A lot of us. People in the military, they make their living off the government, and so I get very upset when we think about our grandmas and those of us who went to public schools and those of us who have served or know someone who's served in the military. I get very upset when they're kind of cast off as government moochers. And so I think that I'll continue to open up the conversation, but I really want people to think about what good our country does for us, and then to think about what we can do for our country as we look at this balanced approach of revenues and spending.
All right, thanks very much, guys. First of all, I'd just like to also kind of build on what Professor Olson was talking about with the deficits. Essentially, why you hear a lot of these policymakers making such a big fuss about it is we find that I think we run the risk of having an investment crisis in which at one point in time, or let me first start by saying that we finance our debt. We finance our debt, but with the selling off of government bonds, which compete then in the market with private capital as well. And essentially in a debt crisis, which this is what currently happening in Europe right now, essentially the investors lose confidence in the government's ability to function properly, and just they lose confidence in their budgetary having a sound budget. And what happens then at that point is that interest rates will then start to climb, which leads to which essentially leads to what you've got happening in Europe right now, where you have interest skyrocketing on the debt, and the bonds then not being able to compete as well. But so I just want to add that part. I didn't elaborate as well. My intro to econ class doesn't quite give me extensive knowledge on the matter, but I just wanted to also mention that because I know that's why people make such a big fuss about it. And in addition to that, what you also see, because they're competing in private markets, then that actually, and there's only so much capital to go around in these markets, it actually can at times crowd out investment in the private sector as well. So in a way, having such a big deficit can lead to the private sector not performing at a level it would otherwise if you didn't have that deficit. And we see that happening considerably according to the CBO in today's economic picture, and that's projected to increase as the deficit grows. Oh.
I have to
Go ahead. That's fine.
Right now, what are interest rates right
Right now, they're very low. They're extremely low. But
Short-term interest rates are next to zero.
yeah, they're very low. Yeah,
And even on long-term treasury bonds,
they're still very low.
market rates are at historic lows, 2-3%. That right now, the demand for credit is so soft and so weak, we can finance our deficits at incredibly low cost. There isn't, I mean, the way crowding out occurs is when the government comes in and says, okay, we're going to sell bonds to finance the deficit. And they, because of this additional supply of bonds, it pushes up interest rates. But we are right now in a historical situation in the financial markets where interest rates are so incredibly low, there's not crowding out. If you talk to and look at the surveys in the banking industry and various non-bank lenders, they're looking for customers. They're looking for good credit-worthy customers to come. Where are they? Why aren't they there? It's because demand is soft.
But
That companies don't want to expand. Look at the housing market. The housing market is still very, very flat.
isn't part of the reason that interest rates are so low, though, because the Federal Reserve has, with quantitative easing, bought out?
The Fed is engaged in a policy that has, provided adequate credit to the economy. It's just that the demand isn't there.
But if they continue down that policy, will it eventually lead to
If and
inflation?
when the economy gets back to full employment. But there, then the Fed has said, in fact, that's sort of what was so stunning about the Fed's announcements in terms of their policy actions. When the unemployment rate starts to get down close to 6.5%, right now it's over 7.5, so 7.8%. When the unemployment rate gets down and when we start to see signs of inflation, the Fed was so, then we will intervene. We will back out of the market. We will start to take all of this excess credit that we've been supplying and we'll withdraw. And so, when the economy has in effect reached that point of recovery, then is the time to be concerned about the crowding out. And that's why that intermediate term structural deficit is the problem. That's why, as I said, you really want to be careful not to conflate these three different deficits. The intermediate term deficit is one that, yes, that structural deficit we do need to resolve, but again, we're looking at the economy operating at full employment. Right now, the economy, in terms of the amount of unemployment that we have, the amount of production and the level of GDP where we are relative to our potential, we're not in a fully recovered state. And so those concerns about crowding out and a credit crisis and the like, those don't apply in this short-run situation. You're applying conditions and circumstances that should be of concern in that intermediate run, back when the economy is at full employment, but not right now in the short run. The other thing I want to correct here is this perception of at what point will the world stop wanting Treasury securities and there'll be some sort of a financial crisis, and comparing us with what's going on in Europe. It's a very different situation in Europe. Particularly the countries that have had financial crises in Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, the pigs, because it's, if you take the acronyms, PIIGS. Those countries don't have their own currency.
Yeah,
They're operating in a single currency zone.
and they also don't have nearly the same central bank system. So I understand.
They don't have the ability
different,
to
definitely,
manage
but
their money supply and credit. They're dependent upon the European Central Bank to manage monetary policy for the European Union. Well, the European Central Bank is largely under the control of the Germans. And they have decided to pursue a policy that is relatively tight. They've bought into the austerity approach. And so the Greeks, the Italians, the Spanish, the white, have had to address fiscal reforms because they don't have these other degrees of flexibility to manage their domestic economies. They're having to, in effect, operate within this different zone, which is not the case for the United States. We do control the value of our money. We have our own central bank, the Federal Reserve.
I agree it is definitely different, and it's definitely a lot easier for it to happen in a place like Europe, but nonetheless, again, I can't really debate with a PhD, but a little over my head, but.
It comes back, though, to the
Let him
point
finish it.
that I was trying to make, is structurally, out in the intermediate run, out there in 2015, 2016, 17, the concerns that you're expressing are right on the mark. That
Okay.
if this economy was operating at full employment and we had the levels and projections of the deficits, yeah, I would be concerned. The bond market would be concerned. The bond market vigilantes would, and we've seen that before. I mean, that goes back to the Clinton administration in 1992, 93, 94.
But I guess what I want to say though is like, and I totally respect your opinion, but I know that there's counter opinions to kind of what you're saying. I mean, I just read a CBO report that was reporting that we should be wary of this in the near future, within the next year or two, that we should implement these because there is a risk of that down the road. So I guess again, I can't really argue with you because I'm a sophomore in college, but
You're doing a good job.
no. But I think again we should just kind of make that clear that there's counter opinions to that, and that there is the risk for that in the intermediate run. The risk for that is down the road, and that builds into my second point that I think in the near future is the best time to address these concerns, because as we continue forward, the interest on our debt is only going to accumulate and grow over time. That's a risk that's going to keep increasing, and in a way, it's putting our generation in an even deeper hole than we're in right now. Our generation is going to be paying enormous interest on this debt, and really, our taxpayer dollars are worth less every day because so much of it is going into funding this enormous interest. And I guess then moving to something I'm more competent in, the balanced approach that we're talking about, jumping into the plan itself, I found that it was actually, I think most conservatives are under the impression that it's actually not a balanced approach at all that we took in this particular circumstances. It was 10-1 in terms of revenue increases to spending cuts this time around, and there's quite a bit out there suggesting that perhaps spending cuts are spending cuts are maybe a little bit less of a burden on the economy than such heavy tax increases. So I think this is really I don't think we're taking this problem seriously enough by going at it at such an angle that's so unbalanced. And I think that we need to really have a serious talk about actually making sincere entitlement cuts, entitlement reforms rather. And I am open to new types of revenue increases. Most Republicans have been over the last month or so, in terms especially of closing tax loopholes. Boehner, what was that?
Which loopholes?
Quite a few. I know there's quite a bit of dispute within the party as to which ones, and nationally obviously as well. But tax loopholes, cutting some certain tax loopholes would lead to enormous revenue gains, and would lead to, and it coupled with sincere entitlement reforms, honestly considering how we can make Medicare and Social Security, put it on a sustainable track that is actually that will make the burden on us, our generation, not our kids. I've been listening to way too much politics, but make our burden much less significant. And I think that essentially, I've been going on for forever. I think we need to take a more balanced approach. I agree with him.
Good. Thanks for your thoughts. I want to just jump in on a couple things. I don't want to necessarily say what we ought to do, but I just want to clarify again a couple terms and some statistics, I guess some facts. So part of the problem here is both parties disagree on the facts. And when you don't have common understanding of what the facts are, it's hard to discuss what the solutions are. So just a couple thoughts. One is we've heard these terms discretionary, entitlements, non-discretionary, and just to clarify what that is. So you take the budget. It's a big. Let's envision a big pie. Okay. About half of that pie is what's called non-discretionary expenditures, non-discretionary spending,
Mandatory.
otherwise known as mandatory or entitlements. This is primarily Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. would that be, yeah, Medicaid would be it. So those are the three, and then you got unemployment and disability and some of those. But the big ones are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Those are what they call non-discretionary because you have to change laws in Congress to change the funding formulas, and so therefore they don't get changed all that often. You can do it theoretically, but the other half, the other 50 cents of the dollar budget, if you will, or the other 50% is what's called discretionary, and that allows Congress to move the dial a little bit more year to year. Of that discretionary money, though, you want to talk about where the spending goes. 50% of every dollar of discretionary budget is military related. Just the facts. I'm not saying one way or the other, but let's get that on the table. So we talk about spending cuts. If you really want to deal with the budgets, if you want to deal with spending, it's got to be military related. It's impossible to bring the budget in balance if you just set military off the table. I mean, just impossible. Dan mentioned the troops and all that, and I get that. And it's really not, yeah, there's a lot of generals and some high-ranking folks, retiring at 6 figures and after 20 years. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the high-tech weaponry, the new fighter jets that the Army, Air Force does, F-30, yeah, F-35 doesn't even want. Part of the problem with the military spending is, again, not the troops and not their benefits, but it's these high-tech weaponry that's made in 30 or 40, parts of these fighter jets are made in 30 or 40 different states. And you have members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, that don't want to see those jobs disappear. And I understand that. That's their job. That's their job to protect jobs in their home districts. But this is the thing this is the part of the budget deficit issues that it's really hard to deal with. Is 50 cents of every discretionary dollar goes towards military-related spending. And so you just simply can't deal with the budget honestly without putting military spending on the table. It's not foreign aid, folks. It's not food stamps. We like to think that, oh my God, it's the food stamp recipients that's killing the budget. It's not. I mean, we can get rid of every darn food stamp tomorrow, and we're going to still have a gigantic deficit and debt. I mean, I'm not saying there's plenty of reforms in social welfare spending. There's a lot of good ideas to reform and change and so on and so forth. But just statistically, that's not where the spend. Foreign aid, you do surveys, public opinion, maybe you guys have heard this before. You ask the American public, what percentage of the U.S. budget do you think goes towards foreign aid? You know what that number is? They say around about, I think we spend around 25% of our budget on foreign aid. And then you ask them the next one, what should it be? Well, they say around 10%. Well, what is it? It's less than 1%. It's not so foreign aid would get zero that out tomorrow, and you're barely going to touch the deficit. Okay? So again, just sort of what's on, just facts.
Matt, if I could I jump in for a little bit here?
Of course you can.
Some things that I think we should draw attention to, and I might address some of your facts.
Please.
National defense, as a percentage of our 2012 fiscal year spending, was 19% of our budget.
That's the total, right?
That's foreign affairs was around 1%.
That includes the entitlements.
No.
So yeah, that's not discretionary.
Correct.
That's
Correct.
That's everything.
That's everything.
That's everything.
That's
Yep.
everything.
So it's about a quarter,
So-
little under a quarter.
So it's significant. Entitlement programs equals about 62%, or around a little under 2/3. We'll say that. So even if you were to completely cut all national defense from our budget,
Right.
which
No one
I think
wants.
Republicans everywhere are
No.
saying, yes, there's stuff to cut, but you're not going to cut everything.
It's hard to do so, too.
And you wouldn't,
Politically.
that'd be unfathomable, especially because constitutionally we hold very dear the fact that we should have some sort of military. So let's just say we make substantial cuts there. That will not completely solve the deficit or budget problems that we're facing. So as Republicans, and I'm interested to hear what Tyler has to say, it seems to me what they're saying is if we're going to look at a balanced approach, yes, military is absolutely on the table, but why do we have to always make these changes?
But it's not. The Republicans
Well,
won't put it on.
Why? Okay, that's something that we can talk about. But why do we always have to legislate stuff in the middle of a crisis? It's something that's always made me curious. Whether it's the Iraq War, whether it's TARP, whether it's bailouts, whether it's the fiscal cliff, and some of it's manufactured, maybe some of it isn't. But I think it's interesting that as a country, we always feel the need, and maybe the new thing is guns now. We always have to legislate in a crisis. But it's interesting to me that we have these similar priorities, where Dan brought up very admirably that we should hold our military personnel in high regard, and I don't think anybody's debating that on both sides. So I think that we can move past that. Now, he brought up some very interesting points about education, about our libraries, about public roads, about firefighters. These are all things that, of course, Republicans are not going to slash. Education as a total percentage of our budget at the federal level is like 4%. Yes, that could be increased. That's something that we can look at. But your point of calling people government moochers is a little unfounded. It's not like people don't want to live without a government. That's not the Republican ideal at all, and I don't think it's very fair to characterize it in that way. And I think, just to try and help Tyler out a little bit, and I don't want to get people bogged down too much in that interest rates and bonds, but the point I'd like to raise, and that we can chew on and talk about, is we are deficit spending, and there's an interest rate to pay on that. And no, it's completely under control. We don't have to worry about it necessarily right now. But we'd like to address these things before it hits that crisis point. Now, as we spend now in the present, that means we're spending stuff now that we wouldn't spend in the past. So we're allocating resources that we'd be spending in the future now. And so that's a government move where they are prioritizing how this would best help the economy. And the point, I think, that a lot of people are trying to make is we want to see that spending be most efficiently used in the marketplace, and government might not always necessarily have the best interest in mind. And finally, with the foreign stuff, and then Tyler, you can jump in, the fear is not the bonds or the interest rates. No, we're not Europe. Yes, we have a better central banking system. No, we're not at a crisis point, nor do we want to be. But when you start talking about your percentage of the GDP as a total of the national debt, that is a conversation we should have. Now, is it there yet? No, Professor Olson has said no, we still have room to play with. So we want to address that now while it's not a crisis, so that we don't have maybe us, ourselves, or our children that have to bear that load, that have to figure out those creative policy issues. And so that's where I think it's going to be really interesting, where our priorities lie, and necessarily in Congress, how we are going to address those. So
I think you just hit the nail on the head. I was just going to make one quick thing. You sort of just said it. And it's not about, we always say debt is bad, and yeah, some debt might be bad, but you know, if we didn't have debt, we wouldn't have this building. Okay?
Absolutely.
I wouldn't live in the house I live in if I didn't have debt. So debt in and of itself is not bad. It's how, as Alex said, it's how you finance that debt. And as you were saying right now, I mean, in the United States budget, debt is, it's what, 16 trillion now, and so as a percentage of our GDP, and the interest on that debt is what we ought to care about most. And I think it is at a point where we ought to significantly take a look at it.
There is, in relation to that, I mean, economists have studied this. In fact, I remember back in graduate school doing an activity, an exercise, a paper on this question of what is called the sustainable level of debt. And it's basically, and we've generally accepted about a debt level of 75% of GDP. So there is a little bit of an apples and oranges here. But the stock of your debt, if it exceeds, over the long run, 75% of what your annual GDP production is, well, then you're getting into a range where it's unsustainable in the sense of being able to generate adequate revenues to make the interest and principal payments on the debt. Temporary short-run deviations from that are permissible or workable. It's when you get into a chronic situation where you're above 75% that we then start to see the financial crisis scenario that you were talking about. So, I mean, that's the concern. We don't, when we look out down the road, the U.S. cannot, in the intermediate or long term, sustain levels of deficits and debts and that's where the crisis scenario comes
yeah.
from. That's down the road.
Professor, could I ask you, what percentage of the debt or is GDP? Like, maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it, but maybe what? Yeah, what percentage? What?
Who's got their iPhone? Somebody Google it.
let's let Tyler finish, so, and then Maddie, I think, wanted to jump in.
Well, yeah, someone actually should Google that. Actually, yeah, that'd be good. But no, I guess the concern is that programs, especially like Medicare and Social Security, are essentially on an unsustainable path that will lead to the debt as a ratio of the GDP being over 75% on a consistent basis. Looking at the programs, I mean, Social Security that was generating more than it was losing until just recently. Well, it's projected to turn around pretty considerably for a while, though. It's around the border right now. You're correct. And then that in addition to Medicare, which is a sizable portion of our budget deficit right now, or our budget as a whole right now. I think it's like what 30%, or it's around that. But no, I guess what I want to say is like programs like Social Security and Medicare that are really the issue here. Again, we're not really, and I think defense should be on the table. I agree with Professor Lindstrom. I think it should be, and I think that's been cutting defense has been it's like the socialism type word where it's just like, oh no, that's bad. But I mean, that needs to be on the table. Everything needs to be on the table. We need to all make sacrifices to get out of this, and if we can spread those sacrifices out and take that balanced approach, then we're going to have a better future. I mean, everyone is going to. It's just going to work out better for everyone if we do that. But yeah, really the issue isn't about necessarily education and things like that. I mean, we obviously need government. We can't afford a sacrifice in areas like that. So it needs to be things. I guess I kind of just contradicted myself. What I mean to say is that all these issues that are being talked about, Medicare, Social Security, tax increases, or revenue gains rather, and then defense, all those type of things need to be on the table. But no, what we need to do is find a way to get programs that are unsustainable on a sustainable path. And you can do that by raising the age of Medicare and Social Security, things like that. Those ages haven't been raised in quite some time, while life expectancy has increased considerably. So it's things like that. How do we make it more sustainable and get it on the right track?
Just real quick as a closing from the Dem side. I happen to see things differently than Alex and Tyler do when it comes to a lack of revenues. They mentioned that it doesn't affect education, that all Republicans are for education. But I mean, we can look right here in Stearns County to see where these lack of revenues do affect our education, because if we're not getting in revenues if we're not getting help funding for education at the federal level, we're not getting help with education funding from the state level, then what it does is it falls to the local communities, and they either have to deal with cuts in their education, or they have to take these really unpopular property tax increases, which to kind of put a microcosm of this federal debate here to home in Minnesota, we saw with Governor Palinte's refusal to raise new taxes. That's happened all across our state, is that the state hasn't been increasing taxes, but because it hasn't, then the burden comes to the local communities to say, okay, then we're just going to deal with these cuts. I mean, there are all kind of schools around here that don't have, Sartell, Sauk Rapids don't have all-day kindergarten. We can see where we have to make these choices where, okay, are we going to raise our property taxes, or are we going to decrease the quality of our education? And so I see things differently. I think that the revenues that the government takes in absolutely has an impact on our education throughout the country and here at home in Stearns County. One other thing that I see differently than my friends is that the Republicans, Mitt Romney, Alex, Tyler, they say they favor a balanced approach. And I felt kind of guilty when I asked Tyler what tax loops he would want to close, or that he would want to get rid of, tax loopholes, because time and time again when Mitt Romney was asked that same question, he couldn't come up with anything. And so, I mean, it comes, we say, oh yeah, we're for a balanced approach, let's get rid of these terrible tax loopholes. Well, I totally agree with them. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I just want to know which ones that they see we should close. Because I didn't get an answer from Mitt Romney. I didn't get an answer from Tyler. I'm sure there are answers out there, but that's just another thing that I'd like to know, so that we can. I'm glad we're on the same page, but let's start actually talking about things and talking about specifics. So, but I agree with a lot of what they've said in terms of that the debt and deficit are long-term problems, both like Professor Olson said at the now and the intermediate and the future. But as Democrats, we're the ones that talk about what revenues we're going to increase, and we talk about what programs that we're going to cut. I'm really curious. I hope Alex has some answers as to what revenues
what you wish
he'd
for,
like
Dan.
to increase.
I'm not sure the Dems talk too much about which programs you want to cut, but that's well, okay, yeah, defense, yeah. I'm not sure on the entitlement reform, so we could do a better job on that. But
Ask her, Grandma, how she likes Social Security.
I think we could reform Social Security. I want to hear from a St. Ben student. There's been too many guys talking. So do we have a St. Ben student with a question or a comment? Please. And we can sit here. Not to put you guys on the spot or anything like that, but any reactions, thoughts, please? Yeah. No.
In the short run, that there are proposals that if you were to reduce taxes, similar to the 2% payroll tax reduction that was or that is now expired, put on average for the typical American family, say earning $50,000, it put $1,000 into their pockets for a year. And that was in place for 2 years, but it expired on January 1st. With that additional revenue or income in the household, they could spend that. Well, now they don't have it. They're going to pay $1,000 a year more in taxes. But the idea is that if you were to continue or extend that, that would lead to some additional spending in the short run that would help the economy recover.
So basically what you're saying is that spending will stimulate production.
Yes.
And in long run.
In the short, that would move us more quickly back to full employment in the long run.
So what you're saying is that we are making a sacrifice right now in saying the spending goes up in order to solve the problem and stimulate manufacturing and all that and move the economy. How possible is that solution? And do they have estimate or projected numbers?
Yeah.
That it works?
Some spending has more power to stimulate economic growth than others, though.
Right.
Not all spending is equal in terms of that capacity.
And do you think it's a good solution, or I just want to hear your opinion on that? Sorry.
Do I think it's when you say I, or when I say I, it's like I would say it's a possible solution. It's one that could work. I mean, but again, we live in a democracy. What I think, I vote, but everybody else who's 18 and older has a vote. That's one possible solution. There are other possible solutions and choices. That's sort of the nature of the democratic system, is that we get to, everybody gets to sort of weigh in. And if the system works, in terms of our representatives getting together and agreeing and say, look, we've got the votes. We prefer this solution as opposed to an alternative solution. I mean, it's a solution, but it's not the only one in terms of addressing the short-term problem.
Well, I wanted to go back to the issue of having a balanced approach, because in the election, of the last two elections, we've seen Republicans who are running pledging that they won't raise taxes by a single cent, and I think it was Norquist's plan that they signed on to, and that concerns me, and it concerns me too when we see afterwards, yeah, we want to negotiate and we want to have compromise, and it seems so false to me. How can you say that you are for compromise when before you even are in the position of making legislation, you're already saying that you won't look at half of it? So how is that compromise? And then if anyone has any insight into that, especially, I guess, looking at the college Republicans, like, how do you, mesh those two ideas when they say one thing and actually sign on to one thing, but then, on the TV programs talk about compromise, and how is that possible?
Well, what we actually just saw was a big revenue increase that the Republicans signed on to with this whole thing. And frankly, I'm not a big fan of pledges in general, but that's just me. I don't know. My party has done a lot of them, but I think the Democrats have too. And this brings me to a point that I want to get back to, actually, just really quick. I'll touch on it briefly. But no, I think we want to see more revenue increases via the tax loopholes. And again, I can't elaborate on them. I'll send you an email, Dan. I promise. No,
CC Mitt Romney, too.
It did fool him, yeah.
Just don't touch my mortgage deduction, my mortgage interest, and charitable contributions.
No.
I want
There's some that are unpopular, yeah. But
unreimbursed employee business expenses. And help me. Yeah.
I guess
We're part of the 47%.
Keep your hands off my Medicare, too.
My name is Melissa Stone. I'm a senior, and I'd like to know what the newly imposed healthcare reform correlates, or how it correlates with the tax reform. The fact that
I know the one thing that was big concern to many companies in Minnesota was the tax on medical devices. And I believe we have Ethan Hellier here is our local expert on that issue because he wrote a memo in my class last semester on that. But that's what was it, Ethan, a 3 point what percent tax on medical devices? Something like that. But that kicked in January 1st in the budget deal, the fiscal cliff deal that kicked in because of the Affordable Care Act, but they didn't change that. So that's one piece of the puzzle in terms of the health care and how to pay for the expansion of Medicare to the new recipients of that. But there's also a lot of other things. There's an extra tax, 3 to some percent tax on high income earners that is earmarked towards the health care legislation as well, and that also is recently. So I'm not sure if it's a partial answer to your question.
So overall, how does this healthcare reform impact the health system? Is it like a positive or a negative in terms of the tax increase?
taxes, to my understanding, had to go up in order to cover sort of the newly inducted people into the system to set up new exchanges. So yes, taxes in general went up under Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, I should say.
Obamacare.
That
We
in
like
fact
that
is
term.
what led.
Obamacare?
Yeah.
You want to own that when we'll talk 10 years later,
Yeah.
but
that's a different topic, gang.
Alex, that's in fact, some of you may recall back during the campaign, there was all this back and forth about, whether the Democrats had cut Medicare or not. What they basically did was they took some funding out of the Medicare budget and shifted it over to the, to cover the Affordable Care Act. But at the same time, some of the costs that would have been covered under Medicare were also shifted over to the Affordable Care. So it was more just an accounting thing.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things where, oh, hey, they're moving money. Let's point our fingers at that, and see if we can get any political traction out of it. And,
Well,
as you saw, that was
I-
an issue of debate.
I won't disagree with you. I do think that in general that, yes, there is some accounting gimmicks that go on, but in general there are severe things enough to where Amy Klobuchar, Al Franken, have backtracked their support of the medical device tax. So whether or not it's fabricated political, I guess, rhetoric or not, the fact that it scared a few Democrats who did vote for the Affordable Care Act. So I think that's something that you need to pay attention to.
You have
And
to keep in mind, the Affordable Care Act was passed in 2012? No, 11.
2 years ago,
10.
3 years ago.
That act has been in place. What we are now seeing is it being implemented.
Right.
That it's being phased in at various steps. So, you know, in some sense, the answer to her question is, you know, these laws or these issues were very different times and with very different Congresses.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't want to get too off track because I think that's a very good question. Maybe we can talk later. But I think that, I know it's getting late. People are going to want to catch the bus. And I think that it's only fair for Tyler to maybe have a last few remarks. But before I let him give those, I have a few bones to pick. And I'll be very quick and brief, I swear, because Tyler represents the college Republicans much better than I ever could hope to. But, yes, Dan, very quickly, education. Federally, I believe that it's not quite the role of the federal government to necessarily get their hands into education. I think local governments should be able to pony up more of their money for it, and I think that's fair. That's a philosophical disagreement we're going to have, and we can talk later. Yes, Mitt Romney did not get too specific when he was running for president because it'd be politically suicidal. It's much easier for Obama to say, yes, I'm going to raise taxes on the 1% or the 5% or people making over $400,000 because that's a smaller number of people, and it's exactly like Professor Olson just said. Well, don't touch my mortgage deduction because it affects me. So it's politically more safe to do what Obama did than to do what Mitt Romney did. Now, I think that it's not the tax. You want some loopholes or some suggestions. I think I should get specific here, and this will kill my political career. So, sorry, bye political career. I think that it's yes, I believe in a progressive sales or a progressive tax. I think rich people have the ability to pay more, and they should pay more. I'm not opposed to that per se. What I think should be more adopted by people everywhere is that you should not be so heavily taxed based on what you make, but by what you spend. So yeah, see, we got some agreement from a professor. So maybe that's sales tax, maybe that's a consumption tax. I might make $1 million, but live like a peasant, yet I'm going to be taxed more. I'm fine with paying higher taxes, but let's say I spend all that $1 million. I should get taxed more based on what I purchase. So closing some of those loopholes. Now, Governor Dayton attempted to do some of that. I haven't had an option to look into everything that he's going to widen the base with, but I think that's something specific, something you can grapple with, and something that I'd like to see you return the favor with some other things. Now I'll let Tyler talk because I'm insightful.
Well, actually, this is probably an appropriate a topic to wrap it up with. I just really wanted to briefly build on what I was saying with the pledges. I just hope that when all of us are ruling the world, that we don't come this close to passing over whatever cliff we may be dealing with. Let's all bipartisanship. Rah, rah.
That's a great way to end.
All right.
Special call to our two students, and thanks, Professor Olson, for your support.
And one last announcement. If you're a Democrat, if you're not a Democrat, then just carry on about your business. But there's a special election going on just east of us. And there's a great Democrat candidate. Her name's Joanne Dorsher. She's running to fight for these things that we believe in as Democrats. And we'll be doing a phone bank for her in Simmons G10, I believe. I've got some phones if you don't have a phone. We're really proud as a club in our oh, thank you. We're really proud as a club of what we're able to do and help elect representatives.